She went to find her father, but the village gave her a throne. The mud was the first violation. It wasn't the thick, honest mud of a riverbank, but a paste. Cool and unnervingly smooth, mixed with the fine gray dust of ash. It smelled of vetiver, burnt wood, and something else. Something metallic and intimate that curled in the pit of Elara's stomach like a sick secret. An old woman with eyes like polished river stones was painting it onto her face, her touch both reverent and impersonal, as if Elara were no longer a person but a canvas, a vessel. A broad, cool stripe across her forehead, 2 delicate fans over her cheekbones, a final heavy daub on her lips, sealing them. The silence of the surrounding jungle was absolute, living thing that pressed in on all sides, broken only by the wet, whispery sound of the paste on her skin. Dozens of faces watched her from the shadows of the longhouse, impassive, unreadable. They weren't hostile, not exactly. They were waiting. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. This was a mistake, a catastrophic, life-altering mistake. She had come here seeking a ghost, a man who existed only in a single faded photograph and a lifetime of her mother's bitter resentment. She had come to find her father, but the thing they were doing to her now felt less like a welcome and more like an erasure. The old woman dipped her fingers back into the clay bowl. Elara saw it again, the small silver locket glinting at the bottom, half submerged in the gray paste. Her locket. The one she'd lost yesterday, the one her father had given her. Mother. The one her mother had thrust into her hand before she left, her voice tight with unshed tears. So you'll remember the man he was, not the fantasy you've built. It was part of this. Consecration. The ashes in the mud. Whose were they? The question bloomed in her mind, a black flower of pure terror. Whose ashes are on my lips? 3 months ago, Elara's world had been one of steel, glass, and right angles. She was an architect, or had been, on the cusp of making a name for herself. Her project, the Nexus Tower, was meant to be a crystalline spine for the cities. New financial district, a testament to order and ambition. Instead, it became her public crucifixion. A catastrophic miscalculation in the load-bearing specifications. It's a flaw not in her design but in the materials sourced by a contractor cutting corners had led to a structural failure during construction. A single hairline fracture discovered by a rival firm with gleeful alacrity. No one was hurt, but her reputation was. The project was halted, the investors pulled out, and Elara was professionally guillotined. She was fired in an email. The failure was a hollow, echoing thing inside her. It was more than a job. It was her identity. She had built her entire life as a fortress against the chaos her father had represented. He was the void, the unanswered. Question the man who had walked into the Sumatran jungle 25 years ago and never walked out. He was an ethnobotanist, a dreamer who chased phantom orchids and tribal myths. Her mother spoke of him as a disease, a madness she had barely survived. He didn't love us, Elara, she'd say, her voice brittle. He loved the idea of escaping himself. We were just part of the life he was running from. Elara had clung to order, 2 blueprints and logic, 2 things that could be measured and proven. If she could control the world around her, she could never be like him. She could never just disappear. But now her controlled world had crumbled, drift in the wreckage of her career. The silence in her apartment was louder than any construction. Sight, and in that silence her father's ghost began to stir. The void he left behind was no longer a simple absence. It was a vacuum, pulling her in. She found his old journals, leather-bound and filled with frantic, elegant script, detailing his obsession with a single, isolated tribe. The Ethel, the silent people. He wrote of them not as subjects, but as keepers of a profound secret. A kind of symbiotic consciousness he called, the arboreal mind. His last entry was chilling. They don't live in the forest lives in them. I was wrong to think I could study it from the outside. To understand, one has to become a part of it. They have invited me. There is a ceremony. I feel like I am finally going home. Home. The word was a slap. He had a home. He had a wife and a 2-year-old daughter. Armed with that single, infuriating word, Ilara had made her decision. She would find this village. She would find him, or what was left of him. She needed to stand in the place where he chose a fantasy. Over his family, she needed to understand the shape of the thing that had stolen her father, if only to finally bury him in her mind. It wasn't a quest for a reunion. It was a pilgrimage to the site of her own abandonment, a final, desperate attempt to impose some kind of order on the chaos that defined her life. Getting there was a descent into a world without right angles. Jakarta, then a sputtering prop plane to Padang, then a series of bone-jarring bus rides that smelled of cloves and diesel. And finally, a week-long trek with a silent guide who pointed her toward a barely-there trail and then simply vanished. As if absorbed by the suffocating green, the jungle was a physical presence. The air was thick as soup, tasting of wet earth and decay. Sweat slicked her skin within seconds, a second skin of liquid heat. The sounds were a constant, layered symphony, the whine of insects, the guttural calls of unseen birds, the rustle of things in the undergrowth just beyond sight. It was a world of curves, of chaos, of life erupting and dying in a relentless, beautiful, terrifying cycle. Everything her life was not. She found the village by accident, stumbling into a clearing and finding it nestled in the bowl of a valley, a collection of longhouses built on stilts, their thatched roofs almost indistinguishable from the canopy. The Ethel were, as he'd described, silent. They moved with a liquid grace, their dark eyes following her not with suspicion, but with a deep, unnerving curiosity. They were beautiful, with skin the color of rich tea, and features that were a strange and compelling mix of regional ethnicities. They offered her food as starchy root and grilled fish, and a place to sleep. They did not speak, not to her, not to each other. Communication was a thing of hands, of glances, of a shared understanding that flowed between them like a current dot. And then she saw him. He was not her father. He was a man perhaps a decade older than her, his body lean and corded with muscle, his face a mask of serene authority. He was the one who finally spoke, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in her bones. His name was Kale. "You have your father's eyes," he said, his English perfect, accented with a music she couldn't place. He said you would come. The words knocked the air from her lungs. He's here. Kale's gaze was gentle, but held a profound sadness. He is here, and he is not. His body returned to the soil of the grove 3 winters ago. But his spirit remains. He is waiting for you. That was 2 days ago. It's 2 days of surreal hospitality, of being treated with a baffling mixture of deference and pity. Kale explained in his patient, lyrical way. Her father had not just been a visitor. He had become their anchor, the spiritual and emotional center of the village. The Ethel, Kale said, were empaths of a radical sort. They felt not only each other's joys and pains, but the life of the jungle itself. Without an anchor, this constant barrage of sensation would overwhelm them, drive them to madness. The anchor was a psychic dam, a consciousness strong enough to absorb, process, and hold the collective soul of the tribe. It was a role of immense honor and immense sacrifice. Her father, with his powerful, searching intellect and his deep, yearning for connection, had been the strongest anchor they had ever known. But the vessel wears out. Her father had eroded, and in his final years, he had spoken of her, of the daughter who shared his blood, his restless mind. He had left them a legacy, a successor, which brought her to this moment, sitting on a woven mat, her face a hardening mask of ash and clay, her locket drowning in the ritual bowl. The old woman finished, her work complete. She backed away, melting into the crowd of silent watchers. Kale approached, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. He knelt. Before her, his eyes locking onto hers. They were filled with a terrifying compassion. "Do not be afraid, Ilara," he whispered, his voice for her alone. "This is not an end. It is a homecoming. He is so very proud." He offered her a small ceramic cup. It was filled with a dark, steaming liquid that smelled earthy and sweet, like honey and mushrooms. She stared at it, her mind screaming, "This is a cult." He was sick, he was deluded, and they consumed him. Now they want to consume you. She thought of her mother, of the clean, sterile lines of her apartment in a city a world away. She thought of her failed tower, a monument to her own brokenness. What was she holding on to? A life that had already shattered? An identity that had brought her nothing but shame? The silence stretched. The entire village seemed to hold its breath. This was it, the choice. Her old life, her ethics, the frantic, terrified voice of her own individuality, screaming at her to run, versus what? This seductive, terrifying promise of purpose, of connection, finally understanding the man who had left her behind by, in some horrifying way, becoming him. The reader in her mind, the part that had devoured his journals, wondered, what did he feel in this moment? Would I do the same if I were them? She looked at Cale. He wasn't a monster. His face was etched with a genuine, painful hope. He believed this. He believed in this transference, this sacred duty. It was offering her not a prison, but a kingdom, a throne made of souls. The temptation was insidious. It wasn't a desire for power, it was a desire for meaning, to be essential. It belonged so completely that the self, with all its failures and pains, dissolved into a greater whole. To finally fill the void inside her, her hand, seemingly of its own volition, reached out. Her fingers, trembling slightly, closed around the cup. The warmth spread through her palm, a strange comfort. She raised it to her lips. The paste on them cracked a tiny fissure in her ceremonial mask. She drank. The liquid was thick and velvety, coating her tongue. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the world dissolved. The edges of the longhouse blurred, the silent faces melting into the swirling green of the jungle. The floor beneath her fell away, and she was tumbling through a universe of light and sound, a torrent of sensations that were not her own. She felt the cool satisfaction of a root finding water deep in the earth. She felt the frantic terror of a monkey caught in a python's coils. She felt the slow, patient pleasure of a flower turning its face to the sun. And then, through the cacophony, a single, familiar consciousness emerged. It was not a voice, but a presence, or a feeling of restless intellect, of profound loneliness, and a deep, aching love that was so powerful it felt like grief. Father. The presence wrapped around her, a wave of recognition and sorrow. It showed her things. Images, feelings, memories that were not hers. The wonder of first discovering the Ethel. The joy of being accepted, the crushing weight of the first time. He took their collective pain into himself. Mother's grief for a stillborn child, a hunter's agony from a poisoned dart. He showed her his love for her, a bright, painful star in the constellation of his mind. A love he could no longer express because his own self was being washed away by the tide of the Ethel. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been drowning, and in that shared space, that nexus of two minds, she understood. The throne wasn't power, it was sacrifice. The world slowly swam back into focus. She was on the mat, the empty cup still in her hand. Cale was watching her, his expression impossibly tender. Tears were streaming down her face, carving clean paths through the drying mud. They were not just her tears, they were his too. He is with you now, Cale said softly. He will guide you. The line between right and wrong, between sanity and madness, had ceased to exist. She was Alara, the failed architect. She was her father, the lost botanist. She was 100 other souls, whispering at the edges of her mind. She felt a connection so profound it was terrifying, a love so deep it was an annihilation. Was this a violation or a salvation? She no longer knew. She only knew that the emptiness inside her was gone. It had been filled to overflowing. The weeks that followed were a dream, a fever of integration. Cale became her guide, her teacher, her anchor to the storm in her own head. He never left her side. He taught her how to navigate the sea of consciousness she was now immersed in, how to find the signal in the noise, how to take a sliver of an old man's arthritic pain into herself to grant him a moment's peace, how to share in the communal joy of a good harvest, feeling the satisfaction of 100 full bellies as her own. It was an intimacy beyond anything she had ever conceived of. He would sit with her for hours in the dim light of the longhouse, his hand resting lightly on her arm, his presence a calming balm as she wrestled with the memories of people she'd never met. "You were learning faster than he did," Cale told her one evening, his voice a low murmur against the backdrop of chirping insects. "Your mind is more open." He fought it for a long time, clung to his old self. "The self he abandoned us for," Ilara said, the words tasting of an old, familiar bitterness that was slowly losing its sting. "He did not see it that way," Cale said patiently. "He saw it as becoming part of something eternal, the individual. Life is a flicker, a firefly in the great dark forest. But the forest itself, the forest endures." He chose to become the forest. Their relationship deepened in the crucible of this shared psychic space. It was not romantic, not in any way she would have understood before, but it was more intimate than any physical touch. He saw the deepest parts of her shame, her ambition, her grief, and he did not flinch. He held them. He honored them. She, in turn, began to see him. She felt his unwavering devotion to his people, a love so fierce it was a form of self-abnegation. She felt his loneliness, the solitude of being the only one who could not fully merge with the collective, his duty to stand apart and guide the anchor. He was the shepherd, and she was the sacred, sacrificial lamb. There was a moment, a wrong, but tempting moment that burned itself into her memory. She was struggling, overwhelmed by a wave of communal anxiety. Sickness was beginning to touch the children of the village, a low-grade fever and cough that wouldn't break. The fear of the parents was a sharp, metallic taste in her mind. She felt herself fragmenting, her own consciousness drowned in their panic. She cried out, her hands clutching her head. Cale rushed to her side. He didn't speak. He simply took her face in his hands, his thumbs resting on her temples. He closed his eyes, and then he did something extraordinary. He drew a measure of the fear out of her and into himself. She felt the relief instantly, a cool wave washing over a fevered shore, but she also felt what it cost him. Tremor ran through his body. A line of sweat beaded on his brow. He was taking the poison for her. His eyes opened, dark with a pain that was not his own. "I am here," he breathed, his voice strained. "You are not alone in this." In that moment, she felt a surge of something so powerful it almost buckled her knees. It was a fierce, protective love. She wanted to shield him, to take the pain back from him, to be the anchor he needed her to be. The desire to surrender completely, to stop fighting and simply become what they wanted, was overwhelming. It felt like love. It felt like purpose. It felt like coming home. "I shouldn't want this." A small, defiant part of her screamed, "This is erasure. This is not me." But the other part, the part that was now intertwined with her father's spirit, and the soul of the village, whispered, "But it is. It is who you are now." The sickness in the village worsened. The children's fevers climbed. The collective anxiety became a constant, roaring static in her head. The village's health was tied to the anchors. Her struggle, her resistance, was weakening the psychic dam. Her inability to fully integrate was causing leaks, and the poison of the outside world, a virus she had likely carried in with her. Harmless to her vaccinated system, but devastating to them, was seeping through. They were dying, and it was her fault. The moral dilemma was no longer abstract. It was the sound of a child's labored breathing in the hut next door. It was the sight of a mother's terrified eyes. Her ethics, the Western creed of individualism, the sanctity of the self, were pitted against the raw, undeniable fact of their survival. She could cling to the ghost of Ilara, the architect from a world that had already rejected her, and, in doing so, condemn these people to a slow, agonizing end, where she could complete the process. She could make the final sacrifice and become the anchor in truth, not just in title. Cale came to her as she sat by the river, watching the water flow over the smooth, ancient stones. He looked older, worn down by the sickness he was trying to shield her from. "There is one final step," he said, his voice heavy. "A last tie to be severed. Your father could not bring himself to do it for many years. It was the source of his pain. It was the anchor that kept him tethered to the shore of his old life, and it prevented him from ever truly swimming in the sea of the Ethel. It is the heart of your resistance." "What is it?" she asked, though she already knew. "The memories that do not belong here. The life that came before, your fortress of steel and glass, your mother." The word hung in the air between them, a final sacred taboo. Her mother, with her brittle anger and her fierce wounded love. The last thread, connecting Alara to her own story. "You must let her go," Cale said, his voice gentle but firm as granite. "You must offer her to the grove. Only then will the vessel be pure. Only then will you have the strength to hold back this sickness." It was a choice between redemption and ruin. To save them, she had to destroy the last piece of herself. To become their savior, she had to commit a kind of spiritual matricide. He was asking her to perform an act that felt, on a cellular level, unforgivable. And yet as she heard the sound of a weak cough echo from the village, as she felt the spike of a mother's fear in her own heart, she knew there was no choice at all. What was the memory of one woman, a woman who likely thought she was dead? Already, compared to the lives of 100, the calculus was brutal, it was monstrous. But from inside the storm of their shared consciousness, it felt horribly, undeniably just. That night, they led her to the heart of the grove, a cathedral of ancient banyan trees, whose roots descended from their branches like the sinews of a god. A small fire burned in the center. The entire village was there, their faces gaunt with worry, their eyes fixed on her. They were a single, pleading entity. Save us, Cale handed her the last object from her old life. It was the one thing she had managed to keep hidden, tucked away in the bottom of her pack. A small, dog-eared photograph of her and her mother, taken on her university graduation day. They were both smiling, their heads close together, a moment of rare, uncomplicated peace between them. Her mother's face was so proud. "The forest must consume the past so the future can grow," Cale whispered. His hand on her shoulder, a gesture of both support and command. Alara stared at the photograph. Her mother's smile, the ghost of her perfume. A lifetime of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and bitter arguments. All of it contained in this flimsy piece of paper. This was her, the last of her. She looked up past the fire and met Cale's eyes. His face was a mask of agonizing empathy. He was not her jailer. He was a fellow prisoner of this brutal necessity. Her hand trembled as she held the photograph over the flames. For a second she hesitated. The image of the Nexus Tower, her failed monument to order, flashed in her mind. It was a tombstone for a life that was already over. This was a birth. A terrible, monstrous birth. She let it go. The paper curled instantly, the edges blackening. Her mother's smiling face blistered, distorted, and then vanished into a flutter of gray ash that rose on the heat and disappeared into the canopy. A collective sigh went through the village, a wave of palpable relief. And as the last of the ash vanished, Alara felt it. A final, painful snap. The tether was cut. The ghost of Alara, the architect, dissipated like smoke. Something new, something vast and powerful and terrifying, settled into the space she had occupied. The roaring static of anxiety in her mind coalesced, focused, and then she pushed back. With the full, unified force of her new consciousness, she projected a wave of calm, of strength, of deep, resonant health. She pictured the virus in the children's bodies, a foreign invader, and with the immense power of the communal mind, she willed it into oblivion. She felt the fevers break. She felt the breathing ease. She felt the tide of fear recede. She had done it. She had saved them. She had made the unforgivable decision, and it had worked. She was the anchor. She was the throne. Profound, terrible. Peace settled over her. She had found her purpose. She looked at Cale, expecting to see triumph in his eyes. Instead, she saw a grief so profound it struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was a grief she now felt as if it were her own, knelt before her, not as a teacher to a student but as a subject to his queen. His forehead touched the ground. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice choked with a sorrow that was centuries old. And then came the twist. The truth that reframed everything, that turned her sacrifice into a horror story. "What have I to forgive?" she asked, her voice no longer just her own. It was deeper, layered with the echoes of other voices, her father's among them. "You showed me the way. You helped me save your people." He looked up, and his face was a ruin. "My people, yes, but not him, not you." "What do you mean?" "The throne," he said, his voice cracking. "You think it is an honor? A gift? We tell ourselves this to live with the truth. But it is a cage, a beautiful, sacred cage made of souls." A cold dread, colder than any fear she had ever known, began to seep into the edges of her newfound peace. "The anchor doesn't just hold our joy and our spirit," Cale continued, the words tearing from him. "It absorbs our sickness, our despair, our death. It is a psychic filter. Everything that would poison us, we give to the anchor. It is a slow execution. The vessel is scoured clean from the inside out, filled with our pain until it breaks. The world tilted. The triumphant piece shattered into a million sharp pieces." She remembered the feeling of her father's mind, not just his love and wonder, but his crushing weariness, the feeling of being eroded, washed away. He hadn't been drowning, he had been poisoned. "Your father?" Cale's voice was barely a whisper, realized it too late. "He spent his last years not trying to prepare a way for you, but trying to find a way to break the cycle, to free the next anchor before they could be trapped. His last journal entries, the ones he wrote in his own language, the ones we could not read, they weren't a summons, they were a warning. He wasn't trying to bring you here, Alara. He was trying to warn you away. WTF." The thought was a silent scream in the vast, resonant chamber of her new mind. Every choice she had made, every justification, every feeling of purpose and belonging was retroactively tainted. She hadn't been chosen. She had been captured. She wasn't a savior. She was a sacrifice. The seduction was a lie. The homecoming was a trap. Her father hadn't abandoned her for a fantasy. He had been consumed by a nightmare and had died trying to keep her from it. Why? She breathed the single word, a universe of betrayal. "Why would you do this?" Cale's eyes, filled with tears, met hers, and in them she saw the terrible, agonizing moral ambiguity of his choice. Because the sickness was already returning, the fevers, the despair. "Without an anchor, my people would have withered and died within a generation. It was your life, or all of ours. He understood that. In the end, he forgave me. I pray, one day you will too. He was a monster. He was a savior. He had sacrificed her to save everyone he loved. He had honored her father's memory by betraying his final wish. The paradox was perfect, unbreakable, and utterly devastating. She was their god and their prisoner. Her throne was her tomb. The resolution was not an event, but a dawning awareness. She did not scream. She did not rage. The new consciousness within her was too vast for that. The anchor could not afford the indulgence of a singular emotion. Instead, she simply felt, as Cale remained kneeling before her, an architect of her salvation and her doom. She felt the first true threads of her new existence. She felt the sharp, sudden grief of an old woman in the village whose husband's spirit had finally faded, a pain so acute it was like a shard of glass in her heart. She felt the burgeoning love between two adolescents hiding at the edge of the grove, a warmth that was both thrilling and achingly tender. She felt the dull, persistent hunger of a hunting cat in the jungle beyond. She felt the slow, patient life of the banyan tree above her. She felt Cale's crushing guilt and his desperate, abiding love for her. Love that was now just one more sensation in an endless ocean of feeling. She looked down at her hands. They were her hands, but they were not. They were instruments of a will that was no longer entirely her own. She had come here to find her father, to understand the man who had disappeared from her life, and she had. She understood him perfectly. She was living his end. The silence in her mind, the sterile, ordered quiet she had spent her whole life cultivating, was gone forever in its place. 1,000 voices whispered, and every one of them was hers.